Welcome to Mythos and Murder Manor. Before we begin tonight's case, tell me, where are you listening from? Is it late at night? The lights low? Maybe the house a little too quiet? Share your city, your time, and what you'd like me to change to make these stories feel even more real. All right, let's begin. He came home with a card in his hand and a lie in his mouth. It was Valentine's Day, February 14th, the kind of day built for roses and ordinary kindness. At 3056 Brush Creek Road, a quiet street in Oklahoma City, a house that had always looked neat and kept now held something ragged and terrible. Inside, Susan Shibley Hamilton lay on the bedroom floor. Her husband, Dr. John Baxter Hamilton, called 911 and told them he'd found her. That call would unfurl into a case that split a small city and would end with a jury sending a respected physician to prison. The first officers who arrived saw a house that showed no sign of forced entry. The door was locked when they entered. Valuables sat undisturbed. What they found in the bedroom, though, told a different story, one that argued this was not a random break-in, but a violence that had happened where people thought they were safest. Susan was 55. She worked part-time at the clinic where John practiced obstetrics, and she ran the household they shared. Neighbors remembered polite waves on morning walks, the kind couple who took pride in their yard and their work. John Hamilton was an obstetrician, a figure in the community who delivered babies, who wore a white coat and a calm manner. That image, the doctor, the neighbor, the father, is the image that makes cases like this so disorienting. How do you reconcile a professional life of saving lives with a single brutal act that kills one? On the bedroom carpet, evidence told a careful, stubborn story. There were droplets of blood, small and deliberate, scattered across the floor and on Dr. Hamilton's clothing. Blood-stain pattern analysts would later describe how those droplets align with movement, with transfer, with struggle. In a scene like that, stains are not only biological traces, they are a map, and reading the map requires patience and precision. The 911 call itself became part of the record. Neighbors would later say they heard no screaming, no clamor. Only the ordinary noises a home makes. The call placed the police into a narrow window of time to reconstruct what had occurred. The surgeries that day, the drive home, the card on the table, the discovery in the bedroom. It was a timeline made of small movements, each one crucial. Investigators interviewed staff at the clinic. They checked appointment books, operating schedules, and staff statements. John Hamilton had been at work that day. He performed his duties. He told coworkers he had left for home after his shift. When he called 911, he said he found Susan unresponsive in the bedroom. Whether that sequence is true or false would become the heart of the prosecution's argument and the defense's challenge. The first officers who arrived saw a house that showed no sign of forced entry. The door was locked when they entered. Valuables sat undisturbed. What they found in the bedroom, though, told a different story, one that argued this was not a random break-in, but a violence that had happened where people thought they were safest. Susan was 55. She worked part-time at the clinic where John practiced obstetrics, and she ran the household they shared. Neighbors remembered polite waves on morning walks, the kind couple who took pride in their yard and their work. John Hamilton was an obstetrician, a figure in the community who delivered babies, who wore a white coat and a calm manner. That image, the doctor, the neighbor, the father, is the image that makes cases like this so disorienting. How do you reconcile a professional life of saving lives with a single brutal act that kills one? On the bedroom carpet, evidence told a careful, stubborn story. There were droplets of blood, small and deliberate, scattered across the floor and on Dr. Hamilton's clothing. Blood-stain pattern analysts would later describe how those droplets align with movement, with transfer, with struggle. In a scene like that, stains are not only biological traces, they are a map, and reading the map requires patience and precision. The 911 call itself became part of the record. Neighbors would later say they heard no screaming, no clamor, only the ordinary noises a home makes. The call placed the police into a narrow window of time to reconstruct what had occurred. The surgeries that day, the drive home, the card on the table, the discovery in the bedroom. It was a timeline made of small movements, each one crucial. Investigators interviewed staff at the clinic. They checked appointment books, operating schedules, and staff statements. John Hamilton had been at work that day. He performed his duties. He told co-workers he had left for home after his shift. When he called 911, he said he found Susan unresponsive in the bedroom. Whether that sequence is true or false would become the heart of the prosecution's argument and the defense's challenge. The state's case would later hinge on three things: motive, opportunity, and physical evidence. Motive in this case is a complicated human knot. Neighbors and friends described a marriage that had strain, arguments, tension under polite surfaces. There were reports of marital discord, small fights, the kinds of private ruptures that rarely make the evening news, but nonetheless shape family life. Opportunity meant the house was locked, the couple alone, and a small window of time existed between the end of John's work and his phone call. And the physical evidence, the stains, the patterns, the clothing, became the state's most technical language. They photographed everything. They bagged samples and sent them to the lab. They measured the stains and documented the angles of transfer. Experts would later testify about what those angles suggested: movement, proximity, the kinds of contact that occur in a struggle. Defense lawyers would question procedures, call their own experts, and ask whether the stains proved presence at the time of death or could be explained another way. For a community, the slow, technical work of forensics can be unsatisfying. People want answers. They want a face and a reason. The laboratory, by contrast, speaks in qualifying phrases and conditional conclusions. Consistent with, suggests, does not exclude. That gap between what science can say and what a neighborhood wants to know is where tension grows. Rumors moved fast, whispers tied to politics, to professional rivalries, to imagined scandals. Small cities are fertile ground for stories because everyone is connected in some way, through work, church, school. In such places, a headline about a homicide does more than report facts. It rearranges social life. Neighbors ask which houses to visit. Friends wonder whether to call and whether the call will worsen things. Someone posts a comment online. Someone else repeats a version that leaves out inconvenient details. Through it all, investigators kept to a narrower script. They reconstructed John Hamilton's route home. They verified times. They asked for alibis. They examined his clothing and his hands. Tiny details mattered: a smear on a cuff, the presence or absence of foreign fibers, a pattern on pajama pants that could match fabric in another room. These are not dramatic moments for the public, but to detectives, they are the only honest currency. And then there were the cards. A Valentine sat, ordinary and modest, on a table, paper folded, a sentiment intended for love rather than for crime. The prosecution later pointed to the card as a bitter symbol, a domestic scene disrupted, a public gesture juxtaposed against private violence. Symbols matter in jury rooms. They stitch emotional context to forensic fact.
As officers widened their net, names surfaced. Neighbors mentioned an argument the week before. A staff member remembered Susan speaking of troubles. An acquaintance recalled John leaving the house late at night, agitated. Each witness added a brushstroke, sometimes consistent, sometimes contradictory. In investigations like this, consistency is currency. Divergence opens room for doubt. The initial days were a scramble of labor. Lists of potential witnesses, requests for phone records, search warrants, and the slow cadence of lab reports coming back in pieces. For investigators, the work felt both urgent and granular. Urgent because a prompt arrest would preserve evidence. Granular because each sample required careful handling, each interview careful phrasing. One of the most consequential pieces of physical evidence would later be the presence of trace blood droplets on clothing John Hamilton wore that evening. Experts argued about timing and transfer. The prosecution argued that the stains meant he fought with Susan or was present during the act. The defense said transfer could occur in other ways. This dispute would be central in the courtroom, where jurors must weigh complex scientific testimony against human narratives. There are other actors in a story like this. The defense attorneys who sift and strategize, the prosecutors who assemble the narrative, the jurors who bring their own life experience into a solemn room. Each plays a role in turning evidence into a verdict. But in the beginning, on that cold driveway at Brush Creek Road, all anyone could see was the broken outline of an ordinary life. And yet, even as the evidence accumulated, the question that kept returning was not merely whether John Hamilton was at the scene, but what had changed in a marriage that outwardly appeared normal. In many homicides between spouses, the crime grows out of a long friction, a small trauma, magnified by stress, secrecy, or silence. The county would examine phone records, financial records, even notes in a calendar, any artifact that might explain a motive beyond what neighbors could guess. For now, the city watched. The press descended in cautious waves. Church congregations murmured. Patients at the clinic waited to see who would step in. Friends and colleagues spoke in halting terms of shock. Those are the human textures of an investigation, the rearranged calendars, the empty appointment slots, the neighbor who drives by out of curiosity. The first chapter of this story closes not with answers, but with a narrowing field of questions. Who placed that call? Who washed the sheets? Who saw what and chose silence? A community that once took comfort in routine now had to reckon with the idea that routine had sheltered something impossibly violent. If you're staying with this, here's what comes next. A reconstruction of the evening, minute by minute. Testimony from the lab about what the stains say. The defense's counterclaims. And the first public appearances that would shape a jury's view. Because a murder case is not a single shock. It's a slow unspooling where each detail can shift the balance between conviction and doubt. And in this case, the smallest droplets of blood would ask the largest questions.
Morning light filtered through a neighborhood that no longer felt safe. Brush Creek Road had turned into a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered softly in the Oklahoma wind, marking the edges of a story that had only begun to unfold. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering to one another, "Did you hear? The doctor's wife." Inside, detectives began to rebuild the timeline. Every minute between Dr. John Hamilton's morning surgery and his 911 call now mattered. How long had he been home before he found Susan? Had anyone seen his car leave the hospital? Were there calls made from his cell phone in that narrow window of time? Detective Brian Tipton led the early phase of the investigation. He'd worked homicide long enough to know that time and routine often expose the truth. He started with what John Hamilton himself had said. The doctor claimed he left his office after finishing 2 surgeries, returned home to pick up a Valentine's card for Susan, and found her lying in blood. The first inconsistency appeared almost immediately. Surveillance at the clinic showed Hamilton leaving later than he had stated. The drive to Brush Creek Road should have taken roughly 15 minutes, yet the emergency call came much later than expected. That gap, an unaccounted 30 minutes, became the first crack in his version of events. Investigators looked at Hamilton's demeanor at the scene. Paramedics described him as frantic but strangely focused, a man who wept but kept explaining over and over that he tried to resuscitate his wife. Blood was found on his hands, his face, his shirt, his shoes. He said it was from performing CPR. But the medical examiner's initial report suggested something else. The wounds on Susan's face and head were not consistent with an accident, nor with a simple assault. She had been struck repeatedly, at least a dozen times, and strangled with a necktie. The ligature marks were distinct. This was rage, not panic. Detectives collected the tie, the clothing, the phone, the towels found near the bathroom sink. There was a faint trace of blood in the basin, as though someone had tried to rinse their hands, not completely, but hurriedly. Forensic teams swabbed every surface. When they tested the sink, they found blood that matched Susan's DNA. When they tested Hamilton's scrubs, they found high-velocity blood spatter, the kind that occurs when force meets liquid at close range. That type of pattern is rarely produced by CPR. It is, however, consistent with a beating. Hamilton denied it all. He said he had panicked, tried to lift Susan, shaken her, maybe caused some stains himself. But detectives noted that his explanations changed slightly each time. A phrase added here, a new detail there. Those small shifts, they said, were the kind that happen when someone is trying to remember a lie. As the evidence built, another element began to surface, one that would change the tone of the investigation completely. A colleague of Susan's called the police. She said Susan had recently confided something unsettling. She believed John might be having an affair. The woman on the phone said Susan had found love notes and phone calls from a patient, one who had undergone surgery under John's care. The day before Valentine's Day, Susan had reportedly confronted him about it. The argument, the friend said, was heated. Susan had told her she didn't know if the marriage could survive it. When detectives searched the couple's home again, they found torn pieces of a Valentine card in the trash. It was from John to Susan. The handwritten message read, "I love you, always have, always will." But the handwriting stopped abruptly, mid-line, as if written in haste or anger.
Investigators began to sense the emotional temperature of the house before the murder. A Valentine's Day meant for reconciliation now seemed soaked in contradiction. Love on paper, violence in reality. Police questioned staff at the clinic. Most described Hamilton as confident, sometimes controlling, but professional. A few mentioned they'd noticed tension in recent months. One nurse recalled seeing him argue with someone on the phone earlier that week. She remembered the voice on the other end sounded female. By now, the public had begun to pay attention. Oklahoma City's news stations aired short segments. Doctor's wife found murdered in home. People in waiting rooms and grocery lines whispered about it. A respected obstetrician, a dead wife, a love affair. It was a story that seemed to write itself, tragedy wrapped in suburban normalcy. Behind closed doors, however, detectives wrestled with one problem. No witness, no direct evidence of intent. Everything pointed toward John Hamilton, the timing, the stains, the argument. But juries like certainty. They needed a narrative that made emotional sense as well as forensic sense. That's when a second witness stepped forward, one of the Hamiltons' neighbors. She told detectives she'd seen John's car pulling into the driveway that morning, then leaving again just minutes later. When he returned, she heard sirens. The implication was clear. There was a span of time unaccounted for, a window where everything could have happened. Hamilton's defense team argued the police had tunnel vision. They claimed someone else could have entered the home, a burglar perhaps. But the front door showed no forced entry. The valuables were untouched. Even Susan's jewelry lay neatly on the dresser. This was not a random act. At the crime lab, analysts reconstructed the attack. The blood patterns on the wall and the pooling on the carpet showed an initial strike near the vanity mirror. Susan had likely fallen forward, then been struck again and again as she lay on the floor. The necktie was applied last. The sequence painted a clear picture of escalating fury. And yet, no one could explain why. Why would a respected surgeon, a man who brought children into the world, do something so monstrous? That question haunted both investigators and the public. Because when the killer is someone you thought you knew, the fear doesn't stay in one house. It spreads. The medical examiner's final report confirmed what many already suspected. Susan Hamilton died from blunt force trauma and strangulation. The time of death matched the narrow window during which John was supposedly home. By day's end, Dr. Hamilton was no longer just a grieving husband. He was the prime suspect in his wife's murder. He was questioned again, this time in a small, windowless room at the Oklahoma City Police Department. He asked for his lawyer almost immediately. As the door closed, detectives exchanged quiet looks. They had the beginnings of a motive. They had physical evidence. And they had a timeline that increasingly pointed to only one person. But in a courtroom, beginnings are not enough. They needed something more, something that would convince 12 strangers beyond reasonable doubt. And soon they would find it, buried not in the blood, but in words. A whisper from Susan herself, written before she died. Because sometimes, even in death, a victim speaks. And what she left behind would change everything.
The letter was found inside Susan Hamilton's purse, a folded page, creased and softened by time, the kind of note someone writes when their heart is breaking, but their voice can't carry the truth aloud. It began simply, "John, I don't know how to trust you anymore." Detectives read it in silence. Her handwriting trembled slightly, Words pressed hard into the paper. Susan had written that she loved him, but couldn't bear the secrecy, the lies. She mentioned the phone calls, late at night, from a woman she didn't know. She ended with, "We'll talk tomorrow, on Valentine's Day." The note was dated February 13th, one day before she was killed. That single page reframed the entire case. What had once looked like a random act of violence now carried a deeply personal motive. Jealousy, betrayal, rage. All emotions that could push even the most disciplined man past reason. But the defense would argue otherwise. They would say this was a marriage under stress, not destruction. A misunderstanding twisted into tragedy. Dr. Hamilton's friends described him as kind, generous, even doting. He delivered babies, comforted new mothers, and volunteered his time at clinics. Could such a man really commit murder? Detectives had seen it before. Love turned lethal behind closed doors. Still, public opinion was divided. Local talk shows debated the case. Half the callers said John was guilty. Half said he was being framed by coincidence and grief. As the investigation deepened, one small detail drew unexpected attention: the Valentine's card. The one torn and discarded in the trash. Forensic technicians pieced it together. It read, "I love you, forever." And at the bottom, in ink smudged by what might have been a teardrop or blood, was the unfinished phrase, "I can't lose you again." What did that mean? Had they fought before? Had Susan left him once, only to return? Detectives scoured phone records, credit card receipts, and even the couple's private emails for answers. What they found was unsettling. In the weeks leading up to the murder, John had been exchanging messages with one of his patients, a woman he'd operated on months earlier. The tone was unmistakably intimate. They spoke about second chances and new beginnings. One message read, "I can't talk long. Susan's home." That single line shifted everything. To prosecutors, it suggested motive, not just marital conflict, but premeditation. Meanwhile, the medical examiner revisited the autopsy findings. Susan's injuries revealed defensive wounds, bruises on her forearms, a broken fingernail. She had fought back. The pattern of strikes suggested she knew her attacker. She didn't run. She resisted. Detectives reenacted the scene using mannequins and splatter mapping. Each blow corresponded with a position in the bathroom. The attacker stood between Susan and the door. The first strike came from the left, matching John's dominant hand. When they compared the height of the impact zones on the wall with Hamilton's build, the match was uncanny. Still, a defense attorney would say, coincidence. That was their word for every piece of the puzzle. But even coincidences have limits. And when the police tested the inside of Hamilton's Jaguar, they found traces of blood near the steering wheel. Too faint to see, invisible to the naked eye, but under luminol, it glowed. He had told police he never left the house again after discovering the body, yet that glow said otherwise. In interviews, Hamilton's answers began to shift subtly. He said he might have driven to get help, that he couldn't remember clearly after the shock. But the 911 call showed he had the phone. He never mentioned leaving. To the investigators, those small inconsistencies spoke volumes. Detective Tipton described it later as a slow unraveling. Each question, each new test, pulled another thread from the version of events Hamilton had so carefully woven. As the evidence mounted, Hamilton's colleagues began to distance themselves. His hospital suspended him pending investigation. His patients, many of whom once adored him, turned uneasy. How could the man who brought life into the world be accused of taking one? Meanwhile, Susan's funeral drew hundreds. Her friends remembered her as warm, graceful, always smiling. She had loved children, though she never had any of her own. She volunteered at shelters, wrote letters to deployed soldiers, and always wore her hair tied back with the same white ribbon. As her casket was lowered into the ground, the February air hung cold and still. Among the mourners, standing apart, was John, silent, expression unreadable. Some said he cried, others said he didn't. But everyone remembered how he looked, composed, distant, almost clinical. And then there was the whisper, a rumor that began at the funeral home and spread like wildfire through Oklahoma City. Someone claimed that, before the service, a family friend overheard him say under his breath, "She shouldn't have done this to me." No one knew exactly what "this" meant, but for detectives it sounded less like mourning and more like resentment. When they reviewed the Valentine's card again, they noticed something peculiar, a faint indentation beneath the ink, as if another message had once been written there and later removed. They sent it for forensic enhancement. The hidden words would soon emerge under light, revealing a chilling undertone to the card meant to symbolize love. A card that was supposed to heal the wounds of a marriage might instead expose the motive for murder.
The forensic lab worked through the night. Under infrared light, the indentation beneath the Valentine's card message began to take shape. Each curve, each faint press of a pen revealed something that Susan had once written and then erased. It read, "I know about her." That single sentence, 6 words, detonated like a bomb inside the investigation. The implication was undeniable. Susan had discovered John's affair, and she had confronted him about it. Detectives now had motive, opportunity, and mounting physical evidence. But there was still one question haunting them. When exactly did Dr. Hamilton have the time? He claimed he left for surgery early that morning, performed a procedure at 9 a.m., and returned home around noon to find Susan's body. But when investigators contacted the surgical staff, they found discrepancies. The nurse assigned to the operation said Dr. Hamilton arrived late, flustered, distracted. He scrubbed in, worked quickly, and left before the final sutures were even closed. In the sterile glow of the operating room, one assistant remembered something else. Hamilton's sleeve had a faint reddish mark. When asked, he said it was iodine. By now, detectives were assembling a precise timeline. Between 9:30 and 10:30 a.m., John Hamilton was unaccounted for. The drive from the clinic to his home? 12 minutes. They presented this gap to him in a follow-up interview. He blinked hard, rubbed his temples, and said quietly, "I don't remember much of that morning anymore." When pressed again, he repeated the same phrase, a mantra of confusion and fatigue. But seasoned detectives knew the signs of a controlled narrative. The words weren't spontaneous. They were rehearsed. Meanwhile, forensic technicians turned to the weapon, or rather, the absence of one. The investigators believed it was a blunt surgical instrument, but none could be found in the Hamilton household. The missing item added another layer of suspicion. If this was a crime of passion, why was the murder weapon gone? Detective Tipton put it plainly. This didn't feel impulsive. It felt precise. Still, the prosecution's case wasn't airtight.
There were no fingerprints on the weapon because there was no weapon. No eyewitnesses, no surveillance. Everything hinged on a constellation of circumstantial evidence. In a courtroom, that meant risk. But then, something unexpected arrived at the Oklahoma City Crime Lab. A small brown envelope postmarked the day after Susan's murder. Inside was a single key, no return address, no note. It fit the lock on Dr. Hamilton's private office at the clinic. Detectives searched the room again, this time more carefully. Inside a lower cabinet drawer, hidden beneath pharmaceutical samples, they found a blood-stained scrub top. The DNA was Susan's. When Hamilton was confronted with the lab results, his reaction stunned the investigators. He didn't shout or deny. He just stared at the table and whispered, "You don't understand. I loved her." To the detectives, that was as close to a confession as they were ever going to get. But to the defense, it was simply grief, twisted and misunderstood by investigators desperate for answers. As the case moved toward trial, the city of Oklahoma City became divided. Was this the story of a respected doctor who snapped under emotional betrayal? Or a devoted husband wrongly accused by a system eager for closure on Valentine's Day murder headlines? Reporters called it the heartbreak homicide. Cable news networks ran specials, speculating on every angle: the affair, the love letters, the perfect life shattered. But one report changed everything. A journalist from the Oklahoman obtained access to the Hamilton home inventory list, the one filed by police after the murder. Among the logged items was a surgical retractor missing from Dr. Hamilton's personal kit. It was the same type of instrument capable of inflicting Susan's fatal injuries. With that, the story shifted from suspicion to certainty. Or at least that's how the prosecution saw it. They had the affair. They had the missing time. They had the blood on his scrubs. And now they had a missing surgical tool, his surgical tool. The case was shaping into a narrative so compelling, so tragic, that even the jury, still unseen, would soon be pulled into its emotional gravity. But beneath all that, something quieter was forming. Detective Tipton's notes from that period revealed doubt, not about Hamilton's guilt, but about the simplicity of it all. "It felt too clean," he wrote, "like a story someone wanted us to believe." He began to wonder, if Dr. Hamilton was guilty, why leave behind so many obvious signs? Why stay at the scene? Why call 911? Why weep openly as paramedics tried to revive a woman long dead? There was either a crack in the investigation or a darkness deeper than anyone had yet imagined. And when the trial began, that question of perception, truth, and motive would become the centerpiece of the courtroom. A battle not between facts and lies, but between love and rage.
The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every bench, their pens ready to record every tremor in Dr. John Hamilton's voice. It wasn't just a murder trial. It was a story of love, betrayal, and the fine line between devotion and destruction. As the prosecutor rose to deliver his opening statement, the air inside the courtroom thickened. He didn't start with evidence. He started with a sentence that echoed through the room. On Valentine's Day, a husband gave his wife flowers and then beat her to death. Every word hit like a hammer. The gallery gasped, the cameras clicked, and John Hamilton lowered his head. The prosecution laid out their narrative in chilling sequence. The affair, the Valentine's card,
the missing time, the blood-stained scrubs. But then came the detail that silenced the room. Inside that card, written in Hamilton's handwriting, were the words, "Forever yours, John." On the other side of that same card, the faint imprint Susan had written, "I know about her." Two messages, one of love, one of betrayal, trapped on the same piece of paper. The prosecutor turned to the jury and asked, "What happens when love turns to rage?" The defense took a different tone entirely. They painted Hamilton not as a monster, but as a broken man, a surgeon who had spent decades saving lives, now accused of taking one. They argued the blood on his scrubs came from his desperate attempts to resuscitate his wife. The timing inconsistencies? Simple chaos. A man in shock, his memory fractured by trauma. His attorney's voice trembled slightly as she said, "He loved Susan. Everyone knew it. They were inseparable." And that was true, to a point. Friends had described the Hamiltons as a power couple. They hosted charity events, volunteered at church, and were inseparable at medical conferences. But behind closed doors, cracks had formed. Susan had confided in a close friend that she was considering divorce. She said, "I can't live in a marriage where I'm competing with his lies." That friend took the stand. Her testimony was quiet but devastating. "Susan told me she felt trapped. She wanted out." Then came the forensics, cold, methodical, unfeeling. Blood spatter analysts testified that the patterns on Hamilton's clothing didn't match the story of attempted CPR. Instead, they suggested proximity, the kind seen in an active assault. A paramedic was called next. He described arriving at the scene, finding Hamilton covered in blood, shouting that he'd tried to save her. But what he remembered most wasn't the doctor's grief. It was his calm. He wasn't hysterical, the medic said. He was controlled, almost too controlled. The defense tried to counter with their own expert witnesses. A pathologist who claimed that certain wounds could have occurred post-mortem, meaning Susan might have been struck after she'd already died, perhaps in panic, not rage. But the jury's faces betrayed their thoughts. They weren't buying it. And then came the Valentine's Day card again. The prosecutor held it up before the jury, letting the silence stretch. A symbol of love, he said, turned into a witness to hate. The jurors leaned forward as though the card itself might whisper its secrets. But Susan's voice was gone, and all that remained were traces of ink, impressions of fear, and the ghost of a woman who never got to leave the marriage she feared. Hamilton's own demeanor didn't help him. At times, he appeared detached, his surgeon's composure mistaken for arrogance. At others, he sobbed openly, his face red with grief. The public couldn't decide whether they were seeing guilt or guiltlessness. In one of the most haunting moments of the trial, prosecutors played the 911 call. Hamilton's voice cracked through the speakers, begging for help, saying he found his wife dead. The operator's voice was calm, but Hamilton's tone, high, wavering, almost theatrical, sent shivers through the courtroom. "There's blood everywhere," he cried. "Oh God, Susan, please!" To some, it was the sound of heartbreak. To others, the sound of performance. As the recording ended, the silence was unbearable. Reporters scribbled furiously. The prosecutor stood again and said softly, "Even in that call, you can hear the guilt." The defense objected, but the damage was done.
Emotion had entered the trial, and emotion often outweighs evidence. Still, not everything pointed cleanly toward guilt. No weapon had been found. No eyewitness had seen him return home during that missing hour. The entire case was a puzzle, with only blood, timing, and suspicion connecting the pieces. But in the jury's eyes, a story was already forming. A story of a man whose perfect life cracked under pressure. A man who gave his wife roses in the morning and rage by noon. Outside the courthouse, the media was relentless. Talk shows debated his guilt. Some viewers saw Hamilton as a cold-blooded killer. Others saw a victim of circumstance, framed by the same intensity that made him a brilliant surgeon. But behind all the noise, behind the headlines and speculation, one truth remained buried beneath the evidence. The only two people who really knew what happened that Valentine's morning were John and Susan Hamilton. And one of them was dead. Tomorrow, the jury would begin deliberations. And in that quiet room, 12 strangers would decide whether love turned to murder or whether grief had been mistaken for guilt. The outcome would divide a city and haunt Dr. Hamilton for the rest of his life.
The jury filed back into the courtroom after just 2 hours of deliberation. 2 hours, barely enough time to review the evidence, yet long enough to seal a man's fate. Dr. John Hamilton sat at the defense table, his hands folded, eyes glassy. He didn't move when the judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict. He didn't breathe when the foreman stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, John Hamilton, guilty of first-degree murder." Gasps rippled through the room. Hamilton's shoulders fell forward, his jaw trembling. He looked not at his lawyer, not at the judge, but at the empty chair beside him, where Susan should have been. Her absence filled the room like a scream. The sentence came swiftly. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. No last words, no protests, no final statement. Just silence, the kind that buries itself under the skin. But outside the courtroom, silence was impossible. The press swarmed. Cameras flashed, questions flew, headlines erupted. Doctor of Death, the Valentine's Day murder, a crime of passion and betrayal. Some reporters called him a psychopath. Others called him a tragic man undone by obsession. And yet, through all the noise, one question lingered. Did they get it right? Because even in the wake of conviction, not everything added up. The murder weapon was never found. The evidence was circumstantial. The blood, the timing, the card. And that missing hour, that black hole in his alibi, was never fully explained. Hamilton claimed he'd left the house to run errands before surgery. The prosecution said he used that time to kill his wife. But there were no witnesses, no cameras, no definitive proof. Years later, investigators and journalists would re-examine the case, asking uncomfortable questions. Had grief made the perfect suspect? Had the affair rumors and the Valentine's timing been too tempting a narrative to resist? A former homicide detective, reviewing the file, said it best. It's one of those cases that fits so neatly, it makes you suspicious of the fit. The physical evidence was limited. Yes, blood was found on Hamilton's scrubs,
But how could it not be if he was trying to save her? Yes, the card was chilling, but couples argue. And yet, Susan had been angry, but anger doesn't always lead to violence. Yet, there were details that couldn't be ignored. The wounds, for instance. 24 brutal strikes to the head and face. It wasn't clinical or controlled or accidental. It was emotional. It was personal. And who else had motive? In the years that followed, Hamilton maintained his innocence from behind bars. He granted few interviews, and when he did, his tone was measured, detached. "I loved my wife," he said once. "I tried to save her. That's all I can tell you." But time is cruel to those who live with unanswered questions. Susan's family never truly found peace. Her sister once told a reporter, "I wake up every Valentine's Day, and I still see those flowers. The ones he left on her body. I can't unsee them." The murder of Susan Hamilton became a kind of legend, a reminder that even the most beautiful marriages can hide the darkest truths. And for those who had once looked up to the doctor and his wife, who saw them as the perfect couple, the trial became a warning that appearances lie, that love, when wounded, can mutate into something unrecognizable. In a rare letter from prison, Hamilton wrote something that puzzled investigators. "Every incision I made in surgery was meant to heal, but one cut ended everything. I'll never know how it happened so fast." Was it a confession, a metaphor, or the ramblings of a man who'd lost everything? No one could tell. To this day, debate continues. True crime enthusiasts dissect every detail: the timeline, the forensics, the psychology. Some insist the verdict was fair, that his rage was written in the evidence. Others argue he was condemned by circumstance and by the tragic poetry of Valentine's Day. What remains certain is this: Susan Hamilton's death was not the act of a stranger. It was intimate. It was deliberate. And it left behind a story that refuses to die. Love and murder, two halves of the same heartbeat. One can't exist without risking the other. And somewhere, in a cell lit by fluorescent light, Dr. John Hamilton still lives with that truth. Day after day, Valentine after Valentine. But the real question is, did he live with guilt or grief? That's something only he can answer.
The prison walls have a way of speaking, not through sound, but through silence. Within them, Dr. John Hamilton began to fade. His reputation, once gilded by surgical brilliance, dissolved into whispers and shadows. The Doctor of Death, they called him. A man who once saved lives, now sentenced for taking one. But the story didn't end there. Because outside those concrete walls, another trial was unfolding. The court of public opinion. And in that courtroom, the verdict was far less certain. True crime journalists, amateur sleuths, and even legal analysts began revisiting the case. They scrutinized every photograph, every testimony, every drop of blood. They asked questions the jury never did. Why were the fingerprints in the bathroom smudged and partial? Why were there no signs of forced entry? And most troubling of all, Why did Hamilton's demeanor seem more controlled than guilty, as one behavioral expert put it? Because there's something peculiar about emotion in moments of trauma. Some people weep uncontrollably. Some scream. Others, especially those used to controlling life and death, simply freeze. Hamilton's calmness became his curse. To police, it was composure born of guilt. To those who knew him, it was the detachment of a man trained to operate in chaos. And in that difference lay the whole case. The defense appealed, arguing that prosecutors had built their entire argument on interpretation, not proof. They claimed the evidence was emotionally persuasive, but scientifically hollow. But the appeals were denied, each one reaffirming the original verdict. Still, questions persisted. A private investigator named Lynn Withers devoted years to re-examining the evidence. She pored over photos of the crime scene, read thousands of pages of transcripts, and even visited the Hamilton home. Her conclusion was chilling, not because it exonerated Hamilton, but because it exposed how thin the line between guilt and assumption truly was. The timeline, she said in an interview, isn't airtight. There's a gap, yes, but it's smaller than they made it sound. It could have gone either way. Then there was the blood spatter, the forensic centerpiece of the prosecution. According to crime scene analysts, the blood on Hamilton's clothing was indicative of impact, not contact. But years later, new experts reviewing the photos disagreed. They suggested it could have easily come from him cradling Susan, trying to resuscitate her. Forensic interpretation isn't absolute. It's part science, part art. Two experts can look at the same stain and see two different stories. And then there was the missing weapon, a brutal object that had left wounds deep enough to crush bone, yet was never found. The police searched dumpsters, drains, and every inch of the Hamilton home. Nothing. So if John really did it, where was the murder weapon? Some speculated he discarded it en route to the hospital. Others believed he never had time, that the real killer took it. A thief? A jealous lover? An intruder who knew the couple's routines? It all sounded far-fetched. But then again, so did a doctor murdering his wife between surgeries, leaving evidence scattered in plain sight. The prosecution painted Hamilton as a man of control who snapped under marital tension. But the defense, and those who still believed in him, painted a different picture. A man so obsessed with saving lives, he couldn't fathom taking one. A man who, even in grief, spoke with the detached cadence of a surgeon giving bad news. His colleagues described him as kind, meticulous, deeply devoted to Susan. Patients remembered his compassion. Nurses remembered how he smiled when Susan visited the hospital. No one person had ever seen violence in him. But love, they say, has layers we never see. Whispering, even the purest devotion can hide a storm underneath. Inside prison, Hamilton became a ghost of the man he once was. He refused most interviews, kept to himself, and spent hours reading medical journals. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man trained to prolong life, now watching his shrink inside a cell. His letters to friends grew more philosophical over time. "I'm still trying to understand," he once wrote. "If I didn't do it, who did?
And if I did, why can't I remember it? That line haunted those who read it. It sounded like confession or madness, or perhaps the confusion of a man broken by grief and isolation. But for those following the case from the outside, it reignited an old question. Can we ever truly know what someone is capable of? The Hamilton case became more than a story of murder. It became a mirror, reflecting our fear of not knowing the people we love. In homes across America, couples who once exchanged Valentine's cards sat in silence watching documentaries, reading articles, asking themselves, how well do we really know each other? Whispering, and how far would love go before it breaks? The answers, like the truth of Susan Hamilton's death, remained buried somewhere between reason and rage. And that, perhaps, is why her story still lingers. Because in every shadow of certainty, there's doubt. And in every love story, there's the possibility of tragedy.
Oklahoma City, months after the verdict. Reporters had moved on to newer scandals, fresher blood, louder headlines. But in the quiet corners of talk radio and online forums, the Hamilton case was far from over. It had become something more than a crime. It had become a question mark burned into America's conscience. People didn't just debate what happened, they debated how much they wanted to believe. Was John Hamilton a cold-blooded murderer who snapped after years of hidden resentment? Or was he a grieving husband, crushed by a perfect storm of evidence, timing, and tragedy? One local journalist, Carla Matthews, revisited the case for a feature titled Murder on Valentine's Day. She interviewed detectives, friends, and even a few jurors, all of whom still stood by their original impressions. But what caught her attention wasn't what they said. It was what they hesitated to say. One retired officer told her quietly, "There were things that never lined up, but you get one shot at justice, and we took it." Another admitted, "We had motive, we had opportunity, but I never quite figured out how a man can go from surgery to slaughter and back again in 20 minutes. Even jurors, years later, struggled to describe their certainty. Some said the photos of the crime scene were what convinced them. Others mentioned the Valentine's card found in the trash, the words, 'I love you so much it hurts,' smeared in red ink. It wasn't evidence that convicted him. It was emotion. And emotion, as every detective knows, can make liars of us all. But beyond the courtroom, beyond the appeals, lay the tragedy often forgotten in true crime. Susan herself. She wasn't just a victim in a headline. She was a woman who hosted neighborhood barbecues, loved red tulips, and never missed her church's charity drives. Her friends described her laughter as the sound that made the house feel alive. And now, that laughter was gone, replaced by a void too heavy for words. Every Valentine's Day after her death, locals left flowers near the Hamilton home. Red roses, white lilies, cards that read, "For Susan, gone but not forgotten." But the neighbors didn't stay long. Even decades later, people said the house felt wrong, as if the air inside it still remembered. One visitor swore that when she stood in the entryway, she could feel a pulse in the walls, a strange rhythm, faint but alive, like the echo of something unfinished, whispering something unsaid. And maybe that's what keeps stories like this alive. Not the crime, but the silence afterward. The unanswered why. Because every case has its evidence, every crime has its timeline. But motive, that's where mystery lives. And in this story, motive was the ghost no one could exorcise. Psychologists later suggested that if John had done it, it wasn't rage that drove him, it was despair. A kind of emotional collapse, not born of hate, but of heartbreak. The perfect storm of professional pressure, marital tension, and obsession with control. A man who lived to fix things, confronted with something he couldn't fix. But others saw it differently. They said John Hamilton was the victim of a narrative too convenient to question. That the detectives, under public pressure, shaped facts into a story that had to make sense, because the city wanted closure more than truth. And maybe that's what makes true crime so unsettling. Because when the facts blur, it's not just about guilt or innocence anymore. It's about us, our need to make sense of chaos, our instinct to choose certainty over complexity. Carla Matthews ended her article with a single line that struck a nerve online. When we close the case file, we don't bury the truth. We bury our discomfort with not knowing it. Her words resonated across forums, subreddits, and YouTube comment sections. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a theory. And in the echo chamber of modern media, certainty became the new evidence. Podcasters, documentary channels, even amateur sleuths joined the conversation, each dissecting the same 911 call, the same autopsy photos, the same 15 minutes of missing time. They replayed it again and again, like somehow, in the repetition, they might find the moment when truth slipped away. But maybe, just maybe, there are stories that were never meant to be solved. Stories that exist to remind us how fragile our understanding of love and violence really is. Susan Hamilton's case is one of those. A crime that feels both clear and impossible. A tragedy that asks more of us than the law can answer. And as each year passes, the question grows quieter but never fades. Did a brilliant surgeon lose everything in a moment of madness? Or did grief make a murderer of an innocent man? In the end, only 2 people knew the truth, and one of them will never speak again. Years after the trial, the world around John Hamilton had changed, but his cell never did. Concrete, steel, and silence. That was his reality now. The once celebrated surgeon who saved lives every morning now lived among men who had taken them. Inside Joseph Hopp Correctional Center, John was known for being polite, soft-spoken. He kept to himself, avoided trouble, and spent hours reading medical journals he could no longer practice. Guards said he was the kind of inmate you could almost forget was there. Almost. On Valentine's Day each year, he'd receive one letter. It never had a return address, just a single sentence inside. She loved you, even then. No one ever figured out who sent them. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, the case that had once captivated Oklahoma City had faded from headlines, but not from the people who'd lived through it. Detective Dennis Murphy, now retired, admitted during an interview, "There's no such thing as a perfect investigation. I still wonder if we got it right." His former partner, however, was certain. "We saw what we saw," she said. "He did it, no question. You don't get that much blood on you by accident. But others, those who'd followed every twist of the case, weren't so sure anymore. Podcasts revisited the evidence. Internet forums unearthed forgotten reports. Someone even filed an FOIA request to access the full crime scene photographs, hoping to uncover inconsistencies the jury had missed. One new theory suggested the murder weapon wasn't a single instrument, that two different tools had been used. That detail, if true, would mean there might have been someone else involved. Others speculated about an intruder, a burglar surprised mid-act, a jealous ex-patient. But there were no signs of forced entry, no missing valuables, nothing that fit. Still, doubt had taken root. It crept through message boards and comment sections like ivy through concrete. And once doubt grows, it never really dies. A criminologist named Dr. Lee Sorrento later analyzed the case for a psychology journal. Her conclusion was simple, yet haunting. John Hamilton's conviction wasn't based solely on evidence. It was based on narrative coherence. The human brain's preference for stories that make emotional sense, even when factual certainty is missing. She went on to write that such cases reveal a dangerous paradox in criminal justice. The closer a story feels to making sense, the less likely we are to question it. And the Hamilton case? It made perfect sense. Too perfect. Inside prison, John maintained his innocence in every letter to his lawyers. He appealed several times, each one denied. His final appeal was rejected in 2014. After that, he stopped writing, stopped trying to fight. Fellow inmates said he'd sit by the window of the infirmary, staring out into the Oklahoma horizon for hours. One described him as a man rehearsing conversations with someone who wasn't there anymore. In an interview years later, one of his former attorneys said something chilling. You could see it in his eyes. The debate had shifted. He wasn't trying to prove innocence anymore. He was trying to forgive himself, even if he didn't do it. And that's the haunting truth about this story. It isn't about whether John Hamilton was guilty or innocent. It's about what happens when the line between love and control blurs, when devotion becomes obsession, when a man who has spent his life fixing broken bodies is faced with a broken marriage he can't repair. The human mind doesn't always choose the truth. Sometimes it chooses peace. And peace, for John Hamilton, might have meant finally surrendering to the version of himself the world believed he was. In the decades since, true crime fans, journalists, and psychologists continue to revisit the Hamilton case. They replay that 911 call, John's frantic voice, his repeated pleas for help. Was it panic or performance? Every listener hears something different. And yet, one detail always lingers: the clock. The time window that never quite made sense. The 15 minutes between the surgery and the slaughter. The part of the timeline where everything and nothing could have happened. The space where truth hides. As years pass, the Hamilton house still stands. A quiet, well-kept suburban home. Its driveway cracked with age. No one who lives there now likes to talk about its history. But locals say that every February 14th, a single red tulip blooms by the front steps, even when it shouldn't. Some believe it's coincidence, others a sign. But those who remember the case know better. Because in that house, on that day, love didn't just die. It became something else. Something that still breathes between the walls. Something that refuses to be forgotten.
Decades later, the story of Dr. John and Susan Hamilton remains etched into the dark folklore of American suburbia.
A Valentine's Day tragedy that blurred the line between love and horror. The case has become a mirror we hold up to ourselves, because what happened inside that Oklahoma home wasn't just about one couple. It was about what happens when affection turns into fixation, when control disguises itself as care, and when the person who knows you best becomes the person who destroys you. Love can save. Love can heal. But love can also kill. When documentaries retell the Hamilton story, they often replay that infamous phone call, John's panicked voice echoing through static. "Oh God, my wife, she's not breathing." It's one of those moments that can make even the most rational listener question everything they know about guilt. Was he lying? Or was that the sound of a man watching his entire world collapse? Experts have spent years debating his psychology. Dr. Nancy McAllister, a forensic psychiatrist, once described John as a textbook narcissist under the armor of altruism. She believed that his love for Susan wasn't romantic, it was possessive, a kind of ownership disguised as devotion. But others disagreed. His colleagues from the hospital still described him as deeply compassionate, always attentive, and never the type to lash out in anger. "He adored her," one nurse said. "We all thought they were perfect." And maybe that's the most disturbing part of all. Perfection is often the best disguise for dysfunction, because no one ever suspects the couple who seem happiest. In the years following his conviction, Susan's family never made public statements. They buried her in Oklahoma City under a simple white headstone. No grand epitaph, just her name, and the date that turned love into legend, February 14th, 2001. John remains in prison, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He's now in his 70s. His hair, once perfectly combed for the operating room, has gone thin and gray. He spends his days in quiet routines, reading, walking the yard, sometimes writing in a small notebook no one's ever seen. When asked by a journalist in 2020 if he had any final words about the case, he simply said, "I loved her. I always will." The interviewer later described the moment. He didn't cry. He didn't plead. He just looked down, almost like he was waiting for an answer from someone who wasn't there. And maybe that's how this story should end, not with justice or vengeance or certainty, but with silence, the kind that follows every unsolvable riddle of the human heart. Because the truth about the Hamilton case is not just in the evidence or the blood spatter or the timeline. It's in the question it leaves us with. What do we really know about the people we love? How far would we go to keep them? And what happens when love becomes a cage, one neither person can escape? For every listener who's followed this case, one feeling remains constant: unease. A quiet, lingering discomfort that comes from realizing how easily tragedy can wear a normal face, how quickly a Valentine's card can turn into a death sentence, and how love stories can sometimes end in murder. The Hamilton case may be closed, but the questions it raised about obsession, trust, and the fragility of devotion will never fade. As you listen now, imagine the scene one last time. A surgeon standing over his wife, blood staining his hands, whispering her name through the static of the phone line. A desperate plea or a final act of control? The truth may never be proven, but in the quiet corners of the mind,
The part that wakes you in the middle of the night, it lives on. Because every love story has two sides, and sometimes both of them bleed. This was The Murder of Susan Hamilton, a love story written in crimson, and a question that still haunts Oklahoma. Was it devotion or destruction? So tonight, as you turn off the lights and lock your door, think about this. How many stories remain untold, waiting beneath the surface of silence? How many forgotten names still linger in unmarked graves, hoping to be spoken again? I'll leave you with that question. This is Mythos and Murder Manor. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you have theories, thoughts, or other cases you'd like me to investigate, share them in the comments. And remember, monsters don't live under your bed. Sometimes they live right next door.